I left him the night I realized I loved him. Not because he pushed me away. He didn't. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I wasn't sure I belonged in a life that suddenly felt real. He gave me a contract with one rule: never fall in love. I broke it, so I packed my bags and walked away, expecting the silence to swallow me whole. Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. The day it began, the sky over the city was a bruised, heavy gray, weeping rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows of a boardroom that felt more like a vault than an office. I sat in a chair made of dark leather and cold chrome, my hands folded tightly in my lap to hide the slight tremor in my fingers. I was 22, wearing a frayed wool coat that smelled of damp public transit and cheap lavender soap, sitting across from a man who owned the skyline. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. My mother had slipped away 2 years prior, leaving my father, Julian Thorne, to drown in the medical bills she left behind. Julian was a broken man. His own failing health and desperate financial choices had finally culminated in a catastrophic collapse, placing him in a high-care facility that we could not afford for another week, let alone a lifetime. The bank had called every day. The eviction notices had piled up on our chipped wooden counter like fallen leaves. I had nothing left to sell, nothing left to pawn, and no one left to ask for mercy. Then came Arthur Vance. He sat across from me at the massive mahogany table, a man carved from winter stone and dark steel. He was older, his hair dusted with silver at the temples, his posture impeccably rigid beneath a tailored charcoal suit. There was no pity in his dark eyes, no predatory gleam, no arrogant smirk of a man buying a desperate woman. There was only a profound, clinical exhaustion, a heavy wall of trauma that he wore like a second skin. Between us lay a thick stack of crisp, white legal paper. It was the document that would dictate the rest of my youth. The Loveless Covenant, Arthur had called it, though his lawyers had undoubtedly given it a much more sterile, bureaucratic title. He didn't hand it over to a proxy. He didn't let his legal team read the terms while he checked his phone. Instead, Arthur leaned forward, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over the table, and turned the pages himself. His movements were precise, devoid of any rushed anxiety. Section 4, subsection B, Arthur murmured, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate against the cold glass of the windows. This covers Julian's ongoing medical care, the facility in the valley, all primary and secondary treatments, physical therapy, and the private nursing staff. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Yes. Arthur didn't look up. He traced the line with the tip of a heavy dark pen. It also includes the utility bills for the residential property attached to his name, the property taxes, and the outstanding liens. Everything is to be routed directly through my private accounts. You will never receive another phone call from a collection agency, Clara. That is my guarantee. He spoke of my father's life and death crisis, the way a mechanic might speak of replacing a fractured engine belt. It was hyper-pragmatic, deeply responsible, and entirely devoid of warmth. And yet, beneath the sterile delivery, I noticed a strange detail. He was checking the exact utility account numbers himself. A man worth billions was manually verifying the overdue heating bill for a crumbling house in the suburbs, ensuring the zeros matched, refusing to delegate the responsibility of my family's survival to an assistant. It was a strange, silent act of thoroughness. It didn't make him kind, but it made him safe. He closed the file, aligning the edges of the paper with the edge of the desk. Then, he finally looked up, meeting my eyes with a gaze so guarded it felt like hitting a physical wall. There is one condition to this arrangement, Arthur said, his tone dropping an octave, settling into the quiet room like a heavy stone. And it is not negotiable. I braced myself, pulling my dignity tightly around my shoulders. I understand. I am ready to sign. Do not agree before you hear it, he corrected gently, though there was no softness in the command. He leaned back, interlacing his fingers. I am purchasing a legal boundary, Clara. I am securing a wife on paper to satisfy the board's archaic demands regarding my estate and family trust. I am not purchasing a companion. I am not looking for a partner. The rule is absolute. We will never fall in love. You will not expect emotional domesticity from me, and I will not demand it from you. We will share a name. We will share a roof, but we will not share our hearts." He stared at me, waiting for the weight of the isolation to register. He was warning me that his world was cold, and that he had no intention of lighting a fire to warm it. "I don't want your heart, Mr. Vance," I replied quietly, keeping my chin level. "I just want my father to live." A microscopic shift occurred in Arthur's jaw, the faintest tightening of a muscle, before he nodded once. He reached across the table and offered me his pen. It was the cedarwood fountain pen. The wood was polished and dark, smelling faintly of old forests and expensive ink. The metal was heavy in my trembling hand. I didn't hesitate. I didn't read the clauses again. I pressed the gold nib to the thick paper and signed away my autonomy, my future, and my right to a normal life. The scratch of the pen was loud in the silent room. No music, no vows, just silence. When I slid the paper back to him, Arthur took the pen, capped it with a soft click, and slipped it into his breast pocket. "Pack whatever you need," he said, standing up, towering over me. "The car will collect you at 6. Welcome to the arrangement, Clara." The estate was located an hour outside the city, hidden behind towering iron gates and a thick, suffocating wall of ancient pine trees. It was a sprawling, cavernous mansion built of rough-hewn stone and sweeping panes of dark glass. When the black car pulled up the winding crescent drive, the rain had softened into a persistent, misty drizzle, coating the world in a damp, gray chill. There was no grand welcome. No line of staff waiting to judge the poor girl who had married the master of the house. The heavy oak door was simply unlocked, and the driver left my single, scuffed suitcase in the grand foyer, before bowing his head and departing into the mist. I stood alone in the center of the entrance hall, the silence pressing against my ears. The floor was polished, cold marble, gleaming like dark water. The air smelled of sharp cedar wood, old paper, and the faint, sterile scent of ozone. It felt less like a home, and more like a beautifully curated museum, where nothing was meant to be touched, let alone lived in. I found my way to the guest wing, navigating the long, shadowed corridors until I located the room Arthur had assigned to me. It was vast and immaculate, decorated in muted tones of slate and cream. A massive bed sat against one wall, draped in heavy silk and pristine white linens. The window overlooked the churning, dark waters of the Sound, the view framed by the jagged silhouettes of evergreen branches. I set my suitcase on the floor. I didn't unpack immediately. Instead, I wandered over to the wide oak dresser, running my fingertips over the flawless polished wood. There, resting perfectly in the center of the surface, was a crisp piece of heavy cardstock. I picked it up. It was covered in Arthur's sharp, precise cursive, the ink stark and black against the cream paper. It was a list. Private security gate code. Direct line to my private office. Bypass the receptionist. Estate physician's emergency pager. Julian's care facility 24-hour nursing desk. There was no signature, no welcome note, no make yourself at home. It was just a tactical deployment of resources, a silent shield of protection established before I had even spent an hour under his roof. He had anticipated my anxieties, my fear of being locked out, my terror of a medical emergency with my father, and he had neutralized them with a few strokes of his pen. It was an act of service so profoundly practical, so completely devoid of emotional expectation, that I found myself staring at the card until the sharp cursive blurred. He didn't want to talk to me about my fears. He just wanted to systematically dismantle them. That evening, the true nature of our loveless covenant took shape. Dinner was served at 8 in a dining room that could have easily seated 30 people. The long, dark table stretched between us, like a physical expanse of ice. Arthur sat at the head, dressed down in a simple black sweater that somehow made him look even broader, even more impenetrable. I sat 3 seats down, wearing a simple, gray dress that felt woefully inadequate in the shadow of such wealth. The food was brought out quietly by a single housekeeper, who disappeared the moment the plates were set. Then the silence descended. It was an acoustic phenomenon, the quiet in that room. It was thick, heavy, and expectant. I picked up my silver fork, hyper-aware of the tiny clink it made against the fine porcelain. Arthur ate with mechanical efficiency, his dark eyes focused entirely on the middle distance, completely avoiding my gaze. He was maintaining the boundary. He was enforcing the rule. I observed him carefully, my pride keeping my posture straight. I was a resilient woman. I had spent years dodging creditors, negotiating with hostile billing departments, and holding my father's hand through agonizing medical episodes. I refused to play the helpless, trembling victim in a billionaire's dining room. If he wanted distance, I would give him an ocean of it. I didn't try to charm him. I didn't ask him about his day. I didn't offer a clumsy joke to break the tension. I simply sat in my chair, eating my meal with quiet dignity, matching his stoicism step for step. The funds for Julian's facility cleared this afternoon, Arthur said suddenly, his voice startling me in the vast room. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He kept his attention on his glass of water. His private room is secured. I carefully set my fork down, making sure it didn't make a sound. Thank you. I appreciate the efficiency. It is a contractual obligation, he replied smoothly, finally shifting his dark gaze to meet mine. The look was flat, revealing absolutely nothing. Nothing more. Understood, I said softly, holding his stare without flinching. Not a prison of cruelty, but a sanctuary of indifference. I could survive indifference. I had survived much worse. As the days turned into weeks, our lives settled into a strange, synchronized orbit. We were two ghosts haunting the same sprawling estate, carefully avoiding each other in the hallways. I spent my mornings in the small conservatory, sketching with charcoal to pass the time, while he vanished into the city to run his empire. At night, we shared the long table, the silence stretching between us, unbroken and heavy. Yet, in that silence, I began to notice the minute details of the man who had bought my life. I noticed the way he rubbed his temples when the corporate fatigue set in. I noticed the rigid, unyielding way he held his shoulders, like a man waiting for a blow that he knew was coming. I noticed that he never raised his voice, never lost his temper, and never demanded a single thing from me. He had walled himself off from the world, locking his heart behind a fortress of rules and contracts. He thought his wealth made him untouchable, and he thought his rules made him safe. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. I just didn't know yet that I was already hearing the echo of his hidden grief, and that the single rule keeping us apart was quietly beginning to fracture. The 6th month of our arrangement bled into the 9th with the slow, steady cadence of autumn rain turning into the bitter, biting frost of early winter. The sprawling Pacific Northwest estate remained a formidable fortress of isolation, yet within its cold stone walls, I had managed to carve out a small invisible life for myself. My chosen sanctuary was the East Wing Library. It was a cavernous, forgotten room built of dark mahogany and towering, 2-story bookshelves that smelled of decaying paper, old leather bindings, and the faint, ever-present scent of ozone. The lighting in that massive space was exceptionally poor, designed decades ago by an architect who favored brooding atmosphere rather than practical utility. Heavy velvet drapes blocked out the meager afternoon sun, leaving the vast room drowning in perpetual, heavy shadows. The estate itself seemed to conspire against warmth. The towering walls of rough-hewn stone absorbed the ambient heat, leaving the endless corridors draped in a permanent, biting chill. It was a house built for a dynasty, yet occupied only by ghosts and echoes. I navigated these silent halls like an intruder, careful never to let my footsteps fall too heavily on the imported rugs. Terrified of leaving a permanent mark on a life that did not truly belong to me, I spent my evenings curled into the farthest corner of a massive, worn leather sofa, my knees drawn protectively to my chest, a large pad of heavy tooth paper resting against my thighs. I sketched with raw, unrefined charcoal, my fingers permanently stained black with soot, working entirely by the dim, inadequate glow of a distant wall sconce. I drew the jagged evergreen branches outside the window, the churning gray waters of the Sound, and the sharp, sterile angles of the mansion itself. The strain on my eyes was undeniable, a dull throbbing ache that settled at my temples by nightfall and refused to leave until morning. Yet, I never asked the state staff for a better lamp. I never requested a single change to the room or my environment. I was a woman living on borrowed time and borrowed wealth, keenly aware that taking up space in this man's world felt like a violation of our rigid boundaries. Asking for a simple accommodation meant having a physical need, and having a need felt dangerously close to accumulating more debt. Julian was safe, his medical care fully funded, his breathing machines humming steadily in a private valley facility. That was all that mattered. I preferred to squint in the suffocating dark, fiercely maintaining my pride in the shadows, rather than asking my husband, flahung for another. But Arthur noticed everything, even when he appeared to be staring blankly through the walls. He was a man who commanded global logistics, a corporate titan who could spot a decimal error in a 100-page ledger at a single dismissive glance. It was foolish of me to think he hadn't noticed the way I rubbed my aching eyes at the far end of the dining table, or the way I massaged my temples when I thought he wasn't looking. One afternoon, returning to the library with charcoal dust, still clinging to the fabric of my gray sweater, I stopped abruptly in the arched doorway. The space had been subtly, irreversibly altered. Standing perfectly aligned beside the armrest of my usual corner on the leather sofa was a customized brass reading lamp. It was not a generic, modern fixture ordered carelessly from a catalog. It was a beautiful, heavy piece of vintage craftsmanship, completely unsuited to the sterile, cold modernism of the rest of the mansion. The metal was dark and polished, anchored by a weighted, felt-lined base that rested firmly on the antique Persian rug. An articulated, mechanical arm stretched perfectly over the center of the sofa, positioning a domed hood at the exact mathematical angle required to illuminate a sketchpad without casting a shadow. I walked over slowly, my heart beating a strange, uneven, fluttering rhythm against my ribs. I reached out with a trembling hand and clicked the heavy rotary switch. A warm, golden pool of light flooded the worn leather cushion. It was bright and clean, completely eradicating the gloom without blinding the eyes, transforming my dark corner into a true sanctuary. He had not left a polite note. He had not mentioned the delivery during our silent, rigidly structured breakfasts. He had not sent an assistant to explain the gift. He had simply perceived a flaw in my daily routine, identified a source of physical pain, and eradicated it with absolute, ruthless precision. It was an act of service so profoundly quiet, so completely devoid of the need for gratitude, that it bypassed every defensive wall I had meticulously built around my pride. He didn't want me to thank him. He just wanted me to stop hurting myself in the dark. Our unspoken bond did not unfold with a sudden spark. It took root within those silent halls, hidden inside unvoiced gestures, growing steadily in the quiet gaps where genuine care needed no verbal confirmation. That night, a severe, howling coastal storm battered the estate. The wind screamed against the heavy glass of the library windows, rattling the antique leaded panes with violent force. Inside, however, the fire burned low and steady in the massive stone hearth. I had been drawing for hours under the warm, protective glow of the new brass fixture, losing myself entirely in the hypnotic friction of charcoal, dragging across the textured paper. Suddenly, the golden pool of light vanished. The low hum of the estate's heating system ground to a halt. The power grid had finally surrendered to the howling coastal storm, plunging the entire mansion into a heavy, suffocating darkness. I sat frozen on the leather sofa for a moment. The sudden silence inside the house stood in stark, terrifying contrast to the screaming wind outside. The only illumination left in the cavernous room was the meager, dying ember glow of the hearth. Setting my sketchpad aside, I carefully navigated the dark, feeling my way toward the fireplace. The dropping temperature was immediate and biting. I reached for a heavy iron poker, intending to stir the remaining logs and coax a little more light into the room. But as I leaned in, a sudden violent gust of wind rattled the chimney. The draft caused a large, precarious log to shift and collapse onto the stone hearth. A shower of bright, searing sparks erupted outward, and a hot piece of burning ember struck the delicate skin on the back of my hand. I gasped, stumbling backward and clutching my wrist as a sharp, stinging pain flared across my knuckles. It wasn't a life-threatening injury, but the sudden shock of it in the freezing dark made my eyes water. I pressed my injured hand against my chest, trying to stifle the sound of my ragged breathing. Before I could move toward the door, a beam of harsh white light cut through the pitch-black corridor. Heavy, measured footsteps approached with rapid, undeniable purpose. Arthur appeared in the arched doorway, holding a heavy industrial flashlight. His broad shoulders cast a massive, distorted shadow against the towering bookshelves. The beam swept the room, instantly locking onto me where I stood cradling my hand in the gloom. He didn't ask what happened. He simply assessed my hunched posture, the scattered embers glowing dangerously on the stone hearth, and the tight, painful line of my jaw. The air between us crackled with a sudden, heavy tension. He turned and vanished into the dark hallway without uttering a single word. I remained frozen by the fireplace, my pulse hammering a frantic beat in my throat. 2 minutes later, his heavy footsteps returned. Arthur stepped back into the library, setting the flashlight on a nearby mahogany table. He angled the beam so it cast a diffused, ambient glow across the Persian rug, softening the harshness of the light. In his other hand, he carried a white metal first aid box. Arthur knelt on the cold stone floor directly in front of me. He didn't ask for permission. He reached out, his long, calloused fingers gently wrapping around my wrist. The contrast was staggering. The man who ruthlessly commanded global empires, whose touch I had expected to be completely devoid of warmth, was holding my injured hand with the absolute reverence of someone handling fragile, priceless glass. He opened the kit with his free hand. The sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic immediately cut through the heavy smell of wood smoke and old paper. He cleaned the small burn with a cool, soothing ointment, his movements meticulous and agonizingly slow. I could feel the residual, freezing cold, radiating from his wet cashmere sweater, mixing with the overwhelming, intoxicating heat of his physical proximity. I kept my breathing deliberately shallow, terrified that any sudden movement would shatter the fragile, intimate silence. As he carefully wrapped a stark white strip of gauze around my hand, his thumb inadvertently brushed against my uninjured knuckles. It was the lightest, most fleeting physical contact imaginable, yet the gentle friction sent a violent electric shockwave of heat straight through the center of my chest. I looked down at his bowed head, at the faint silver threads in his dark hair, and at the specific hypnotic flex of the tendons in his wrist as he secured the bandage. The realization did not arrive with a cinematic crescendo, nor a sudden, theatrical gasp of clarity. It hit me with the quiet, devastating, absolute finality of a collapsing floor. I was falling in love with him. I didn't just feel profound gratitude or silent protection or the financial salvation of my dying father. I felt a raw, terrifying ache in the very center of my chest. It was a heavy, physical pressure, a desperate yearning that defied all logic and reason. Sometimes love doesn't knock, it waits. It waits in the quiet spaces, in the warm glow of a reading lamp, in the meticulous, silent bandaging of a burn, until you have absolutely no defenses left to raise. I had fallen in love with my own husband. Arthur secured the edge of the medical tape, his thumb lingering for a fraction of a second over my erratic pulse. I inhaled sharply, a tiny, involuntary hitch of breath that betrayed the sudden, violent awareness of my own heart. The sound echoed off the dark shelves, a glaring betrayal of the boundary I had just crossed in my mind. Arthur froze instantly. The absolute, statuesque stillness of his body hovered before me, suspended in the tense, heavy air. I kept my eyes fiercely locked on the dark wall behind him, terrified he would look up and see the ultimate betrayal written in my gaze. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, vibrating violently with the terrifying reality of his touch. Instead of speaking, he slowly released my hand. The floorboards groaned in protest as he stood up, with abrupt, military precision. The intoxicating heat of his presence vanished instantly as he backed away, retreating rapidly into the dark corridor and leaving me entirely alone in the pale light, trembling violently from a touch that had rewritten my entire world. The aftermath of that stormy night fundamentally shifted the atmospheric pressure of the entire house. The absolute, clinical indifference we had so carefully negotiated began to fracture, replaced by a hyper-aware, vibrating tension that followed us from room to room. We did not speak of the power outage in the library. We did not speak of the burn, the first aid kit, or the lingering warmth of his hands. But a new, dangerous ritual emerged in the deep quiet of the winter evenings, a silent negotiation of shared space that slowly began to dismantle my carefully guarded mind. Every night at 10 o'clock, long after the estate staff had retreated to their private quarters, the massive, sterile kitchen became our unspoken meeting ground. Arthur would descend from his corporate study, his silk tie discarded, his posture finally stripped of its rigid boardroom armor, to boil water at the sprawling granite island. He never formally asked if I wanted to join him, and I never officially accepted an invitation. But without fail, a 16th cup always found its way to the exact opposite end of the cold marble counter. Mine was the chamomile teacup. It was a chipped, unremarkable ceramic mug I had rescued from the very back of a forgotten lower cabinet. It was a cheap, heavy thing entirely out of place among his flawless crystal and imported bone china, yet I clung to it fiercely every night. It felt grounded, deeply human, and flawed, much like myself. Arthur, standing 10 feet away, drank a bitter, dark peppermint blend from a delicate porcelain teacup, its surface pristine and translucent against the harsh, recessed, overhead lights. We would sit at opposite ends of the vast kitchen island, separated by an ocean of polished stone, enveloped in a silence that no longer felt like a defensive weapon. Instead, it felt like a heavy blanket of unsaid truths. The only sounds in the massive room were the low, mechanical hum of the industrial refrigerator and the occasional sharp crack of sleet settling against the dark window panes outside. It was during one of these deep, quiet nights that the final, load-bearing pillar of my emotional endurance completely collapsed. I was staring down at the pale yellow liquid in my chipped ceramic mug, letting the rising steam warm my tired face, when I found my gaze drifting upward of its own accord. I didn't look at his stoic, unreadable face. I didn't look at the broad, exhausted line of his shoulders covered in dark cashmere. Instead, I looked at his hands. I stared at the specific way his long, calloused fingers wrapped around the delicate, painted rim, the exact same fingers that had so gently tended to my burn. I studied the faint, silvery scar that crossed the knuckle of his right index finger, observing the steady, unyielding grip of a man who routinely crushed rival corporate empires, now carefully supporting a delicate piece of fired clay. The sheer weight of my own secret was becoming unbearable. The terrifying ache in the center of my chest, born the night he bandaged my hand, had only deepened into a desperate, consuming affection. I wanted to close the 10 feet of sterile distance between us. I wanted to walk across the cold marble floor, pry the cup from his exhausted, scarred grip, and smooth the heavy, endless tension from his brow with my own 2 hands. I wanted to hear him say my name without the formal distance of a contract dictating his tone. But his one ironclad rule stood between us, like a wall of shattered glass. Pure, dignified panic seized my throat, choking off my air supply. The agonizing reality of loving a man who had explicitly forbidden it was a slow, crushing poison. I immediately pulled my hands back from my ceramic mug, snatching them into my lap, as if he could physically see the depth of my affection, written in the erratic pulse of my veins. The sudden, jerky, uncoordinated movement caused the heavy, rough bottom of my cup to scrape harshly against the polished granite. The sound was like a gunshot in the perfectly quiet room. Arthur paused mid-sip. His dark, impenetrable eyes snapped upward, locking onto my face, with a terrifying, piercing intensity that pinned me to my chair. He didn't speak a single word, but his sharp gaze demanded an immediate explanation for the sudden violent break in our peaceful, established rhythm. The silence which had been my ultimate sanctuary for the past 10 months suddenly felt like a tightening around my ribs, crushing the breath from my burning lungs. I looked away instantly, staring fiercely at the grout lines of the floor tiles, my heart hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm of sheer, unadulterated terror. I had broken the loveless covenant. The exact words he had spoken in that sterile corporate office echoed in my mind, stark, cold, and utterly unforgiving. I am not purchasing a companion. I am not looking for a partner. The rule is absolute. We will never fall in love. I was a woman of my word. I had kept my pride intact, through crushing, humiliating poverty, through the daily, vicious harassment of ruthless debt collectors, and through the soul-crushing transaction of signing away my own autonomy to save Julian's life. My quiet dignity was the absolute only currency I had left to my name in this world. I absolutely refused to lose it now, by becoming a pathetic burden, a weeping, desperate inconvenience clinging to the tailored suit of a man who had explicitly drawn his emotional boundaries in permanent ink. The billionaire had built a fortress to keep the world out, to protect a heart he claimed he no longer possessed. I could not stay inside his impenetrable walls and play the role of a dutiful, empty vessel while my own heart, battered itself bloody against the cage of his rules. Living a transactional lie in his house would eventually turn my warm affection into bitter resentment, and his cold indifference into tragic pity. I would not allow him to pity me. I would not wait for the inevitable day he looked across the kitchen island and realized I had failed to uphold my end of the bargain, that I had become exactly the kind of emotional liability he had paid millions to avoid. If I stayed, the unrequited, agonizing proximity would slowly destroy whatever was left of my soul. I needed to leave. I had no desire to punish the man sitting across from me. Nor did I want to manipulate a dramatic confession out of a man who had frozen his own emotions. I simply needed to survive him. I slowly pushed my heavy wooden chair back, the harsh scrape of the legs breaking the silence once more. I stood up without ever looking back at his face, carrying the heavy, agonizing weight of my decision out of the harsh overhead light and into the dark, freezing hallway. Tomorrow, I would pack my solitary battered bag. I would leave my wedding ring and a quiet farewell note next to the cedarwood pen on his marble desk. Tomorrow, the quiet sanctuary we had accidentally built would come to an end. The morning of my departure arrived without fanfare, slipping through the towering glass windows in pale, indifferent shades of slate and frost. The storm from the previous night had exhausted itself, leaving behind a heavy, suspended fog that swallowed the jagged silhouettes of the evergreen trees. I woke up long before the estate staff began their quiet, synchronized routines. The house was entirely silent, a sprawling, cavernous tomb of cold stone and polished marble that had briefly, foolishly, felt like a sanctuary. I did not linger in the massive bed. I pushed the heavy silk sheets aside, my bare feet flinching against the biting chill of the hardwood floor. I moved through the dim light of the guest wing with the practiced, soundless efficiency of a ghost preparing to erase its own haunting. I pulled my weathered canvas holdall from the very back of the sprawling walk-in closet. It looked absurdly small and pathetic against the backdrop of imported mahogany shelving. When I opened it, the rusted zipper gave a sharp, metallic whine that made me wince, a harsh intrusion into the absolute quiet of the morning. I began to pack, a process that required agonizingly little time. I did not touch the pristine row of tailored cashmere sweaters, the heavy wool coats, or the elegant silk dresses Arthur had instructed his assistants to purchase for my public appearances. Those items belonged to the billionaire's wife, a fictional entity created by a legal document. They did not belong to Clara. I took only the frayed gray sweater I had worn on the day we met, my worn denim, and a few basic necessities. Not a fleeing victim, not a broken wife, just a woman quietly reclaiming her dignity. Before I closed the suitcase, I paused, my hands resting on the rough canvas edge. A strange, heavy ache settled at the base of my throat. I left the room and walked down the long, shadowed corridor toward the master wing. I had rarely crossed this boundary, fiercely respecting the territorial lines of our arrangement. But today was an exception. The door to Arthur's private dressing room was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, the hinges entirely silent. The air inside smelled intensely of him, a sharp, intoxicating blend of ozone, dry cedar wood, and the faint, bitter edge of black coffee. Draped carelessly, over the back of a velvet chair, was his favorite heavy charcoal wool scarf. He had worn it the previous evening when he returned from the city, the fabric still holding the faint memory of the freezing coastal wind. I walked over and picked it up. The material was dense and incredibly soft against my rough, charcoal-stained fingers. I held it for a long moment, pressing my thumb into the woven threads, allowing myself one final, pathetic moment of weakness. I could not smooth the deep, exhausted lines from his forehead. I could not cross the cold marble of the kitchen island to hold his scarred hands. I could not be the warmth he so desperately needed, but actively refused to accept. But I could leave his space ordered. With slow, meticulous care, I folded the heavy wool edge over edge, aligning the corners with absolute precision, and placed it neatly into his open accessory drawer. It was a silent, invisible act of care. It was the only goodbye I allowed myself to give to the man himself. I returned to my room, zipped the canvas suitcase, and carried it down the grand, sweeping staircase. The marble steps felt heavier beneath my boots today, the sheer scale of the mansion, pressing down on my shoulders like a physical weight. I bypassed the entrance foyer and walked directly toward his corporate study in the West Wing. The room was a fortress of dark wood and severe angles, dominated by a massive executive desk that commanded the space like an altar. I set my suits by the door and approached the desk. From my coat pocket, I pulled out a single, blank piece of heavy cream cardstock. The exact same unyielding paper he had used to leave me the list of emergency contacts on my first night. I uncapped my own cheap plastic pen, explicitly ignoring the expensive writing instruments, perfectly aligned in his leather organizer. I sat in his heavy leather chair, the leather cold and stiff beneath me, and began to write. I did not draft a dramatic confession of my forbidden affections. I did not write a tear-stained plea, asking him to change his mind, nor did I demand an apology for the sterile cage he had placed me in. I loved him too much to manipulate him, and I respected myself too much to beg for crumbs from a starving man. Arthur, I wrote, my handwriting sharp and steady, betraying none of the violent trembling in my chest. Julian's medical debts have been permanently settled, and my presence here is no longer required to satisfy the board's demands for your estate. I find myself unable to maintain the strict emotional boundaries required to uphold our arrangement. To prevent myself from becoming a liability to your peace, I am removing myself. My obligations are fulfilled. Thank you for my father's life. I set the pen down. The ink dried quickly against the thick grain of the paper. Next, I reached for my left hand. The heavy, flawless diamond engagement ring sat on my finger, a brilliant, freezing shackle of light. I grasped the platinum band and pulled it loose. It slid off with reluctant friction, leaving behind a pale, indented circle on my skin, a physical ghost of a promise that was never meant to be real. I placed the ring exactly along in the center of the cream cardstock. Finally, I reached into the inner pocket of my coat and retrieved my personal, signed copy of the Loveless Covenant. The thick stack of legal paper felt toxic in my hands, a documented record of my own commodification. I laid it on the pristine surface of the desk, perfectly centering the document beneath the note. I then aligned the cedarwood fountain pen, the very instrument he had used to purchase my autonomy, exactly parallel to the edge of the contract. The visual arrangement was stark, clinical, and completely devoid of human warmth. It was a mirror, reflecting the exact environment he had demanded I live in. I stood up, pushing the heavy chair back into place. I did not look back as I picked up my worn luggage and walked out of the study. The heavy oak front door of the mansion opened with a deep, resonating click. The biting winter air instantly rushed into the foyer, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. A local taxi I had called an hour prior was idling at the base of the Crescent Drive, its headlights cutting through the thick morning fog. I stepped out onto the wet stone, the cold seeping instantly through the thin soles of my boots. I pulled the heavy door shut behind me. The mechanical thud of the deadbolt sliding into place felt like a gunshot echoing across a desolate canyon. I was leaving the grandest estate in the region, but I was walking away homeless, because I had quietly learned that home isn't a place or a name. It's a person, and the person I loved was locked inside a fortress I was no longer willing to besiege. I did not witness the exact moment his rigidly ordered universe collapsed. I was already miles away, sitting in the shadowed corner of a northbound coastal train, watching the rain streak the cold glass, my hands buried deep in the pockets of my threadbare winter jacket. But months later, in a quiet room that smelled of old paper and sea salt, he would finally surrender the absolute truth of that evening to me. He told me that when his black corporate car pulled up the winding Crescent Drive, the estate looked exactly as it always had, imposing, dark, and impenetrable. He stepped out of the vehicle, his broad shoulders carrying the agonizing fatigue of a brutal 12-hour negotiation. He walked up the stone steps and unlocked the heavy oak door, stepping into the grand foyer. Normally, the silence of the house was his ultimate armor. It was a carefully cultivated vacuum, designed to keep the unpredictable, messy demands of human connection safely locked outside the gates. But the moment he crossed the threshold that evening, the atmospheric pressure of the mansion felt fundamentally wrong. The silence was no longer a protective shield. It was a heavy, suffocating weight pressing against his lungs. He looked toward the coat rack. My frayed wool coat was missing. He looked at the floor by the baseboard, My scuffed, water-stained boots were gone. A sudden, sharp-bought spike of adrenaline pierced through his heavy corporate exhaustion, but he forced it down, burying it beneath years of disciplined, stoic denial. He told himself I was simply in another wing. He told himself I had finally gone to visit Julian in the valley. He methodically unbuttoned his suit jacket, draped it over a chair, and walked toward his corporate study to drop his briefcase. He saw the arrangement on the desk immediately. Arthur Vance was a man who processed complex data at terrifying speeds. He could read the hidden vulnerabilities of a rival corporation in a single glance at a balance sheet. When he looked at the cold marble surface of his desk, his brain instantly decoded the clinical, devastating still life I had left behind. The diamond ring, catching the meager moonlight. The neatly stacked pages of the Loveless Covenant. The precise parallel placement of the cedarwood fountain pen. It was a formal termination of services. He walked around the desks, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the dead air of the room. He picked up the heavy cream cardstock. He read the polite, emotionless words I had written. I find myself unable to maintain the strict emotional boundaries required. I am removing myself. He told me that his hands, which had remained perfectly steady while dismantling multi-billion-dollar empires, began to violently tremble. He did not scream. He did not sweep the heavy crystal tumblers off the desk in a fit of melodramatic rage. He simply stopped breathing. The invisible, iron-clad walls of his emotional fortress didn't just crack, they vaporized, leaving him entirely exposed to a level of agonizing vulnerability he had spent his entire adult life trying to outrun. She didn't leave because she was angry. He realized in the crushing quiet. She left because she was following his rule. She had fallen in love, and rather than burden him with an affection he had legally forbidden, she had quietly packed her single bag and disappeared to protect his peace. His own armor had crushed her. His own rule had gutted the only genuine connection he had ever accidentally built. Arthur dropped the cardstock back onto the desk. He turned and walked out of the study, his movements slow, mechanical, and entirely unmoored. He walked through the dark, freezing corridors of the massive estate, drawn purely by muscle memory toward the east wing. He stopped in the arched doorway of the library. The cavernous room was pitch black, the heavy velvet drapes completely blocking the moon. The air inside still held the faintest, lingering ghost of my presence, the dry, earthy scent of raw charcoal mixed with the soft, herbal sweetness of chamomile. It was fading rapidly, retreating into the cold stone walls. He navigated the dark room without turning on the main overhead lights. He walked toward the far corner, his hand brushing against the worn leather of the massive sofa. Beside it stood the vintage brass reading lamp, the silent, beautiful piece of craftsmanship he had personally sourced and installed to protect my aching eyes. Arthur sat down heavily on the very edge of the leather cushion, exactly where I had spent hundreds of hours drawing in the shadows. He reached out, his long, calloused fingers wrapping around the cold, heavy brass switch of the lamp, but he did not turn it on. He refused to illuminate the empty space. He refused to look at the blank, unused sketchpad sitting abandoned on the side table. Instead, he sat in the absolute, crushing dark. He pulled his knees forward, resting his elbows on his thighs, and buried his face in his hands. The vast empty mansion pressed in around him from all sides, a monument to his wealth and a tomb for his heart. He had successfully protected his empire. He had successfully maintained his boundaries. He was perfectly, completely safe. And in that profound, echoing silence, the older billionaire finally realized that safety was just another word for dying completely alone. The adhesive smelled of crushed almonds and old dust, a sharp organic scent that anchored me to the present moment. I sat on a wobbly wooden stool in the back room of the coastal bookshop, a heavy bone folder gripped firmly in my right hand. The spine of the 19th century poetry volume was severely cracked, the leather flaking away like dry autumn leaves. I applied a thin, meticulous layer of binding glue along the exposed binding, my movements slow and fiercely concentrated. This was the only way I knew how to survive the sprawling, echoing quiet of my new life. I had to keep my hands moving. I had to focus entirely on the tactile, physical reality of broken things, because if I paused for even a fraction of a second, the phantom weight of a dark cashmere coat would settle over my shoulders, and the memory of a cold, cavernous mansion would drag me under. Maren Brooks was a woman who understood the profound grace of leaving things unsaid. The older bookshop owner never asked why I had arrived in the rainy coastal town with nothing but a battered travel bag and a haunted look in my eyes. She simply handed me a heavy canvas apron, pointed to the restoration desk, and offered me a quiet sanctuary of work and peace. Every morning, Maren would place the daily newspapers on the front counter. Every morning, I would deliberately turn the financial section face down against the warped pine wood. I absolutely refused to look at the business headlines. I did not want to see the name of his corporate empire in stark black ink. I did not want to read about the stoic, impenetrable billionaire who was undoubtedly continuing to conquer the skyline without missing a single beat. I was building a genuine, functional life of quiet independence. I was not hiding out in distress, and I was certainly not waiting to be found. I had made my choice to walk away from a toxic emotional cage, and I intended to stand firmly by that decision, even as my own heart ached with a relentless, suffocating pressure. The only tether I maintained to my previous existence was the weekly phone call to the high-care medical facility in the valley. When I dialed the nursing station from the shop's rotary phone, my knuckles turned white as I gripped the receiver, bracing myself for the inevitable news that the funding had been abruptly cut. I had broken the arrangement. I had fled the estate. By all logical corporate metrics, I had defaulted on our agreement. Yet, the head nurse simply gave me a cheerful update on Julian's breathing treatments, confirming that the anonymous private trust was still fully covering every single expense. The older tycoon had not retaliated. He had not leveraged my father's life to punish my sudden departure. He had silently, ruthlessly kept his word. That quiet, honorable act of service did not make my absence easier. It made it infinitely harder, confirming the terrifying truth that the man I loved was fundamentally good beneath his impenetrable glacial facade. By 6 o'clock, the weak coastal sun had entirely surrendered to the encroaching storm. The rain began to lash against the bookshop's front windows in heavy diagonal sheets. I hung my apron on a brass hook, bid a quiet goodnight to Maren, and stepped out into the freezing deluge. The walk to my small, drafty cottage at the edge of town took 15 minutes. The wind howled off the dark ocean, biting through the thin fabric of my tattered outerwear, chilling me straight to the bone. When I finally unlocked my modest front door, the interior of the cottage was practically freezing. The space was sparse, consisting of a single main room with peeling floral wallpaper and a battered armchair pushed close to a small stone fireplace. It was a staggering, jarring contrast to the sweeping glass and polished marble of the Pacific Northwest estate. There was no vast library here. There was no vintage brass reading lamp to cast a perfect, golden pool of light over a leather sofa. There were only heavy shadows, the smell of damp wood, and a profound, isolating chill. I knelt on the uneven floorboards and spent 10 minutes coaxing a small, sputtering fire to life in the hearth. The damp kindling hissed and smoked, offering very little heat. But the meager orange glow provided a tiny sliver of comfort against the howling storm outside. I remained on the floor, pulling my knees tightly to my chest, listening to the aggressive rhythm of the rain hammering the tin roof. The absolute solitude of the cottage pressed heavily against my eardrums. Then the sound came. It was not a frantic pounding, nor a hesitant tap. It was 3 heavy, deliberate knocks against the thin wood of my front door. The sound possessed a distinct, unyielding gravity that instantly paralyzed my lungs. My heart slammed against my ribs with a violent, terrifying force. No one in this coastal town knew exactly where I lived, and Maren never visited after hours. I slowly rose to my feet, my legs feeling entirely numb, and walked toward the small entryway. I did not check the window. I did not ask who was there. I simply reached out with a trembling hand and turned the deadbolt. The door swung open, fighting against a sudden gust of freezing wind. Arthur Vance stood on my narrow, rotting wooden porch. The visual shock of his presence in my small, mundane world was completely staggering. The billionaire who commanded global empires was completely out of his element, stripped of his immaculate corporate armor. He wore a dark coat, but he carried no umbrella. The heavy rain had entirely soaked his clothes, plastering his silver-dusted hair flat against his forehead. The freezing water dripped steadily from his sharp jawline, soaking into the collar of his shirt. He looked completely exhausted, older than I had ever seen him, his broad shoulders lacking their usual rigid, impenetrable posture. The sharp, intoxicating scent of ozone and cedarwood washed over me, instantly short-circuiting every single defensive wall I had spent weeks carefully rebuilding. He did not step inside immediately. He stood in the freezing downpour, his dark, intense eyes locking onto my face with a look of absolute, unprotected desperation. "You are incredibly difficult to find," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried over the screaming wind. I stood frozen in the doorway, my hands gripping the edge of the wood, so tightly my joints ached. I had expected anger. I had prepared for cold, clinical indifference. I had never, in my wildest dreams, prepared for a billionaire carved from granite to look as though he were actively bleeding out on my front porch. I stepped back, pulling the door wider, offering a silent invitation. He crossed the threshold, bringing the storm inside with him. He filled the tiny, drafty room entirely, his massive presence making the low ceiling feel immediately oppressive. I pushed the door shut behind him, cutting off the howl of the wind, leaving us enveloped in a dense, suffocating silence punctuated only by the crackle of the struggling fire. I did not offer to take his wet coat. I did not offer him a towel. I simply stood by the wall, fiercely maintaining my physical distance, terrified that if I stepped any closer, the gravitational pull of his presence would completely shatter my resolve. "Julian's facility," I whispered, my voice trembling despite my desperate attempt to keep it steady. "You kept funding it, even after I broke the arrangement." "I made a promise to secure his life," Arthur replied softly, not moving an inch toward me. He kept his hands buried deep in the pockets of his wet coat. "Your departure did not alter my obligations. I am a man of my word, Clara." "Then why are you here?" I asked, the question hanging in the cold air like a physical blade. "You bought a legal boundary. I couldn't uphold it. I removed myself to protect your peace. You got exactly what you demanded in that boardroom." Arthur closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. A muscle feathered violently in his jaw. When he opened his eyes again, the final, ironclad walls of his emotional fortress completely vaporized. He slowly withdrew his right hand from his coat pocket. His long, calloused fingers were visibly, violently trembling. The sight was so fundamentally unnatural, so completely foreign to the stoic tycoon I knew, that I felt the breath leave my lungs in a sharp gasp. In his shaking hand, he held a thick, folded stack of legal paper. The edges were damp from the rain, the black ink slightly blurred, but I instantly recognized the heavy weight of the document. It was the Loveless Covenant. The dark ink from the cedarwood fountain pen had bled through the expensive paper during the storm, turning the stark, sterile rules into illegible, messy smudges. "I built this contract because I was a coward," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a raw, fractured whisper that commanded the entire room. "I built a sterile cage because I believed that if I never allowed myself to feel anything, I could never be broken again. I thought I was keeping myself safe." He took one single, hesitant step toward me. He did not look like a man demanding compliance. He looked like a man begging for his life. "But the safety was a lie," he continued, his dark eyes shining with a profound, unshielded grief. "The moment I found your note on my desk, the silence in that massive house became a tomb. I have spent the last 3 weeks suffocating in the exact peace I demanded from you. I don't want the boundary, Clara. I don't want the protection." He turned away from me, his wet boots leaving dark marks on the peeling floorboards, and walked directly toward the small stone hearth. He stood before the sputtering, meager flames, holding the thick legal document out over the fire. "You kept your promise," Arthur whispered, staring into the orange light. "You left because you refused to burden me with an affection I had explicitly forbidden. You maintained your dignity. Now I am asking you to let me surrender mine." He opened his hand. The thick stack of damp legal paper dropped into the struggling fire. The heavy pages smothered the flames for a terrifying second, before a sharp gust of wind down the chimney suddenly caught the edges. The paper curled, blackened, and erupted into bright, violent fire. We stood in absolute silence, watching the strict, clinical rules of our arrangement turn into fragile, gray ash. He did not burn a copy. He burned the original, physical contract, permanently destroying the legal barrier that had defined our entire existence. The fire flared higher, casting a warm, flickering light across the harsh, exhausted angles of his face. He finally turned back to look at me, his chest rising and falling heavily beneath the soaked wool of his coat. "I do not know how to do this," Arthur admitted, his voice entirely stripped of its corporate authority, leaving only a quiet, desperate honesty. "I do not know how to be a husband without a set of rules to govern my behavior. I will probably fail. But if you allow me to stay in this drafty room, I will spend the rest of my life learning how to properly earn the heart you tried so hard to protect." The absolute surrender of this powerful, unyielding man broke the final lock on my own heavily guarded heart. I did not rush across the room to throw my arms around his neck. I did not offer a grand, theatrical declaration of forgiveness. Our story had never been built on loud melodrama. It had been built on quiet, practical acts of devotion. Instead, I watched as he slowly reached into the deep left pocket of his wet coat. With agonizing care, he withdrew a small, familiar object that had been meticulously wrapped in a dry cloth to protect it from the storm. He unwrapped the fabric and gently placed the item on the small wooden table beside the armchair. It was the chamomile teacup. He had packed my chipped, unremarkable ceramic mug and carried it across the state, bringing the single flawed object that had anchored our silent, late-night rituals directly to my new sanctuary. It was the ultimate, irrefutable proof that he saw me, valued my flaws, and wanted to continue our quiet routine in whatever space I chose to occupy. A single hot tear finally slipped down my cheek, tracing a slow path over my jaw. I didn't wipe it away. I simply looked at the man who had abandoned his empire to stand soaking, soon wet in my tiny living room. "You should take off your coat, Arthur," I whispered softly. The heavy, agonizing tension finally bleeding out of the room, replaced by a deep, profound sense of absolute peace. "I will go boil some water. People ask sometimes, what changed? I don't know if I have a good answer. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. All I know is this. The man who once offered me a sterile contract now sits quietly in a drafty coastal cottage, offering me a warm cup of tea while the rain beats against the glass. And that, I think, is the real vow. I don't need a ring. I don't need a ceremony. I just need him here every day sitting beside me, even in silence. That's what I call forever. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please leave a like and subscribe to sit with us again.